So, the nice thing with this too is I've got, pardon me, this is still quite hot, but I've got an actual soldering tip and a blowtorch tip.
Ah, cool.
So,
link in the description below. No, not really. But if we can find one, I'll try to.
You can probably find a lot of these at Fry's.
Okay.
Basically, any place that does a lot of electronics that would carry a lot of soldering stuff.
And price point on those would be?
I don't know. It's been years.
Okay. So obviously this is a good tool. It lasts a while. We recommend. So this is the heat shrink process. You're just going to go around nice and even, and that sucker will hug the wiring and the connector quite nicely. And that helps. Is that a watertight seal, or what's the point of heat shrinking?
Heat shrink is mostly a non-conducting barrier.
Okay.
So what this means is electricity won't flow through it. So if something bridges this, it's not going to flow any electricity through it.
Okay, so it's basically like shrink wrap electrical tape.
Yeah, it's your electrical tape that you would use to cover metal to keep it from conducting electricity. But it's a nice little shrinkable tube, and it actually sits. And with connectors and stuff, or joints that you have soldered, since it shrinks to a very tight fit, it won't actually move.
Okay.
Being there's no adhesive to break down, it won't ever actually break down.
Gotcha.
All around, just a good way to go about it.
Alright, so let me see if I can get this part here. So we're done with that side. So now we're ready to move on to the other side, is that correct?
Yep.
Alright, so we're looking at 16 AUG wiring. So I'm going to go to the 16, which is like right here, and probably go about that high, or maybe a little shorter, you think? Well, that's one way to find out. So we're actually
a little bit less.
A little bit less.
Right about there.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and squeeze it tight.
You can always cut a little more off your wire.
True.
But you can't put it back on.
That's true. Alright, so we do the circular thing, which makes sure it cuts all the way through. And then this should just slide right off, which it did not, because I was not aggressive enough with that.
If it doesn't, you can usually pinch them, because it'll be most of the way through. Just pinch it and pull it
right off. Okay, so now that's done. Now, what we're looking to do, we need to switch the tip on that, which is probably still pretty warm, so be careful.
As you take these apart, not right away. So this is
alright, then we throw the little thread thingy back on. Alright, and then we get some solder, which is right here. And this is lead solder, I assume, so obviously we don't want to bring this in. Breathe that in too much. You can hear it.
I think this is lead solder.
So don't breathe it in.
I believe so. Really what burns off of these is it's a resin core, so if you look at the end, you'll see almost a little hole there. That hole actually is resin on the inside, and that resin is actually what helps create a really nice bond.
Alright.
That wire, that solder is actually a little too thick for what we're doing, but as long as you're a little... That'll take a minute to get out. Yeah. As long as you're delicate and really just kind of tap it, you're fine. With a smaller gauge of solder, you can feed a lot more.
Gotcha. So for airsoft purposes this works, but it's not ideal. Alright, so we are, what did you say this process is again? That we're
tinning.
So basically we're just putting a little bit on here. Kind of prep the iron, and we're going to put that on the bottom so we get a nice solid seal. Ooh, and we're not going to burn that down. Austin's going to do some nice electrical tape there so we get that nice and good, and we're going to put that there. And what we're doing right now is we're heating the wiring.
If you go kind of next to it, you'll get a little melt to help get that transfer into the wire. Good.
Okay. So I probably put a little too much on there.
A little heavy isn't bad.
You can always take more off. Can't put more on. Well, you can put more on too.
Yeah. Solder's a little easier to work with than actual wire lengths, anything like that.
Okay. So that part's done.
So now we're gonna
untape that.
Go back the other direction here.
And we're gonna do the opposite. So we're gonna tin Again, well, this has already got some on here still, so we're good as
Yep.
far as that goes.
And then you're gonna tin the top face there.
Okay, so I'm going to put the little bit that's already on there.
So the way I like to do these
Mm-hmm.
is I like to kind of come in perpendicular and go right on this front and then feed from the top almost from the back.
Okay.
That way you're getting heat transfer in to here
Okay.
and you're getting the solder to kind of come down from the top.
Now, wouldn't I want to angle that to an angle like that?
It won't really matter. The
Okay.
heat's actually going to pull the solder.
Gotcha. So we're going to see some anti-gravity stuff here, guys. This is going to be pretty cool. Check it out. See, it's sucking it up because of the heat
Yep.
difference.
Cool.
All right, so we're going to let that cool for a minute. We got the solder. And then what we're going to do is we're going to merge the two together, which isn't going to require any more solder. Is that correct? Oh, yes.
Generally, no.
This is the important thing right here. Make sure you put the heat shrink on before you do this.
And try to do it while everything's cool.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's going to shrink up on you.
Suck it in as we go.
You've got all these gears here. Don't be afraid to slow your turn, but just lean into it.
This is going to be a little crossed, but...
All right.
So, this one is going to be a little bit goofier.
Because we put it on kind of upside down-ish.
Yeah, so the way this one sits naturally is we're essentially on the wrong sides. So we got to cross them, which isn't that big of a deal, but usually it
Yeah.
slightly twists the wire.
Okay.
So the best way to do this one is going to be to actually hold the wire by hand
Okay.
and get it in the right place.
All right.
Otherwise, we could use both clamps.
So we're gonna do this, and then gravity should just take it over.
Yep. A little bit of downward pressure on the wire to make sure it sits down into the solder at the bottom.
Ooh, good song. Cranberries. Zombie. Very appropriate, given it's the day after Halloween.
And then you can use the side of the iron and smash it down this way.
All right. It is getting quite warm, but I think it is on there pretty good. We're gonna let it sit. And how do we turn this on?
Press the button. Little button, little button. Yeah.
And now it's off. Now that'll be cooling off. All right. Now it should have had enough time to cool, correct?
Yep.
So we're gonna test it by giving it a tug. It's on there pretty good. I'm actually rather impressed with myself. All right. So then what we're gonna do?
So, this is still a little warm to slide it up, so we're just going to let that sit for a second.
Yep.
Um,
So the one thing I noticed is the wiring itself actually gets pretty warm underneath the sheathing, even pretty far away from the
Yes.
the iron. I mean,
So-
I'm talking like down to here.
yeah,
It's
a lot
still
of the
pretty
heat's
warm.
going to wick away, and with the NiCads, the metal hydrides, that's not a big consideration. But with lithiums, they're much more sensitive to heat and other non-normal operating condition things.
Yes.
So that heat transfer is going to become very important, especially if you have very short wires to deal with. That's where this process of tinning everything and putting it together in a short
Quickly.
amount of time
Yes.
is significantly better.
Quickly but efficiently and
Yes.
correctly. That's the important thing. So in
The-
other words, if you're going to start trying this out yourself, this is for the folks on YouTube, we recommend that you start with a nickel metal hydride battery, and as you get more comfortable doing this, working your way to lithium polymer
Or just
or
spare
lithium
wire.
ion. Or spare wiring to practice the actual soldering.
So the
process.
other thing you can do if you have short leads is this style of tool is metal, and metal wicks heat fairly easily. So you can put a bunch of these clamps on and it'll help wick heat away. You can do a number of things. You can keep a little bit, get like an eyedropper, drop a little bit of water on the sheathing, not enough to cause any short circuits, but something to absorb the heat, because that is going to be one of your major considerations if you have short leads on a sensitive battery.
Makes sense.
Same thing sometimes with connectors. Since the connector part is actually plastic, if you transfer too much heat into your connector, you're going to start melting the connector. And what that could cause is this whole plate will get loose and the plate might pop out. And that's kind of a good case. Worst case,
As the whole thing closes
whole thing
up,
kind of closes. You have a lot of issues.
and you're basically having to
Yeah.
cut it and start over.
You've got to cut the whole thing off, start over.
And now you've got even less wiring to work with.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, don't get too hot with this stuff, guys. This would be bad news. So we're going to let that slide up and hopefully cover it up. I put a little too much solder on there.
So, with these, since this heat shrink that they gave us is fairly small for this wire size, I usually have a big box of different size heat shrink tubes around, and you cut these to length, whatever length you need, and pick the right size for the wire gauge that you're using. We don't necessarily have that luxury.
I was going to say the heat shrink's already on there, so we're kind of stuck with using that one. Unless
we can pull it apart if we want.
This is what
But
always happens.
if I don't have to actually pull it apart,
So this works.
I don't really want to pull it
with
apart.
the gear here, so it doesn't spin backwards.
Somewhere.
Now I forget so we don't want to lose this. So we're just going to keep this together right here.
fun
And that's
gearbox.
3 sets of gears.
You guys will get the video that's on Kevin's head later on.
Your main
So,
is your drive. Okay?
one thing we can do to kind of circumvent having to pull this all apart and getting less solder on it, which is going to be more difficult than putting more solder on. Solder is a relatively soft, it's usually lead or silver. So we can take any metal file
And file some of it down.
and just kind of file this down and get it down to the right size. You don't want to press too hard because you might actually break the solder connection, and then you got to do it all over again.
Which is what
But
we're trying to avoid doing to begin with.
Yeah,
Now,
we-
can we stretch the heat shrink tube to go around it?
heat shrink does not stretch very easily.
Okay, and it's
It's-
probably prone to tearing.
It's not really prone to tearing, it's just very hard to expand.
Gotcha.